All right, so you know how much we love digging into these declassified documents, and today's batch is a real doozy.
Oh yeah, big time.
We're talking early 1960s Cuba, right at that flashpoint in U.S.-Cuban relations. You sent us this whole collection of intelligence reports, internal memos, you name it.
The real nitty-gritty stuff.
Exactly. And honestly, it's a little overwhelming at first glance.
Yeah, I can imagine. So much going on.
Tons of detail, sometimes conflicting viewpoints, you know the drill. But that's why we're here, right? For this deep dive, we're going to sift through it all, pull out the most important insights.
Exactly. Cut through the noise and get to what really matters.
Basically, give you the inside track on understanding what was happening with Cuba in those crucial early years of the decade.
I like it. The inside track.
So think of this as your crash course on, well, a whole bunch of stuff. Like, what were the United States' main goals when it came to Cuba?
Right. Their whole policy approach.
Exactly. Then how much were the Cubans actually involved in stirring up revolutions in other parts of Latin America?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Huge. And maybe the most fascinating part for me, what kind of information were the spies relying on?
Oh, the intelligence game. Always juicy.
Super juicy. And how accurate was it really? Because, there are always surprises and sometimes things just go completely sideways.
Oh yeah, intelligence can be a wild ride. So are we ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
All right, so first things first. Let's set the stage. We're talking early 1963. Just a few months after that whole Cuban Missile Crisis thing.
Right. Still fresh in everyone's minds, for sure.
No doubt. And we have this really interesting memo prepared for a big meeting of the National Security Council Executive Committee in January. It lays out the U.S.'s core objectives regarding Cuba and what they were aiming for.
Like their playbook for dealing with Castro and the whole situation?
Exactly. So first and foremost, top of the list, security. I mean, understandable.
Oh, absolutely. After all that nuclear brinkmanship, you got to think they were a little on edge.
No kidding. The U.S. wanted to make absolutely sure there were no more offensive weapons coming into Cuba. No way, no how. They were talking about the safety of the U.S., of course, but also the whole Organization of American States, the OAS.
So keeping the whole Western Hemisphere safe, that was the big priority.
Absolutely. They also wanted to make sure all those Soviet troops that were still in Cuba, after the missile crisis, got out of there.
No more Soviet boots on the ground, period.
Nope. And of course, they wanted to prevent Cuba from making any aggressive military moves against other countries in the Caribbean.
So basically, neutralize any direct military threats from Cuba, short-term, long-term, the whole shebang.
Exactly. But it wasn't just about military stuff. The U.S. was also really worried about Cuba's influence, like their ideas and political system, spreading to other countries in the region.
Right, like a domino effect, spreading communism throughout Latin America.
Exactly. That's what they were afraid of. So another major objective was to try to weaken Castro's ability to support what they saw as, subversive activities and uprisings in other OAS countries.
So containment, basically trying to stop the spread of communist influence.
Exactly. But they weren't just playing defense. The U.S. also had these long-term goals for Cuba itself, like what they wanted the island to look like eventually.
Regime change, right. Getting rid of Castro and putting someone more U.S.-friendly in power.
Yeah, that was definitely the ultimate goal. But they also wanted to try to encourage changes within Cuba that might lead to, a split with the Soviet Union and the whole communist bloc.
Like nudge them away from the Soviets and towards a more democratic system.
Exactly. It's all right there in this memo. But, achieving all that, it required a ton of information.
Yeah, you can't make good decisions without good intel, right?
Totally. And that's why the last key objective they lay out is to create this huge, comprehensive intelligence picture of Cuba.
Basically, know thine enemy, know the situation, know everything.
As much as possible, yeah. That was the idea. So those were the big goals. But how were they actually going to pull it off?
Right. What were the concrete options they were considering?
Well, at the time, there were these really sensitive negotiations going on, led by this guy, James Donovan. Remember him?
Vaguely. Remind me.
He was a lawyer, a real negotiator extraordinaire. He had already helped secure the release of those pilots captured during the Bay of Pigs invasion, and now he was trying to get more American prisoners out of Cuba.
High-stakes stuff.
Oh, yeah. And the memo says the U.S. needed to be super careful not to mess those talks up by doing anything too aggressive while they were waiting for the results.
That makes sense. Don't rock the boat while lives are on the line.
Exactly. But they also knew they had to have a backup plan, right?
Okay.
Just in case the negotiations fell apart.
I'd like plan B if things went south. What did that involve?
This is where it gets interesting. The memo outlines these 4-point shipping orders.
Okay, break those down for me. What were they?
Essentially, it was a way to put the squeeze on Cuba, economically and logistically. First, they'd shut down U.S. ports to any ship carrying weapons to Cuba or involved in Soviet bloc Cuba trade. It didn't matter what country the ship was from. If it was helping Cuba, it was banned.
Wow, a total embargo on anything military or Soviet related.
And then, to make things even tougher, no American ships could enter Cuban ports or carry any goods to or from Cuba.
So hitting them where it hurts, their ability to trade and get supplies.
Right. And the memo says that if Donovan's negotiations failed and the prisoners weren't released within 5 days, the U.S. would inform NATO and the OAS about these shipping orders and put them into action.
A pretty strong message to Castro and the Soviets, like, we mean business.
Absolutely. It shows you how high the stakes were and how seriously they were taking the whole situation.
Okay, so that's U.S. policy towards Cuba. But what about what the Cubans were up to themselves? We've got this report from the Subcommittee on Cuban Subversion that covers July and August of 1963. It goes into detail about all these reported efforts by Cuba to, stir the pot in Latin America.
Yeah, trying to spread their revolution to other countries, sparking those communist uprisings the U.S. was so worried about.
Exactly. So where did these reports say they were focusing their efforts most intensely?
Well, a lot was happening in Brazil. The report says that the Cuban ambassador there was super active, encouraging a local peasant league and trying to pump new life into similar organizations all over the country.
Providing inspiration and guidance, like, here's how you do a revolution, Brazilian style.
Yeah, but it wasn't just talk. They were putting their money where their mouth was, too. And the report specifically mentions financial support coming directly from the Cuban embassy to these groups.
So direct involvement, funding potential revolutionaries. What about more hands-on stuff, like training or supplying insurgents with weapons?
That's where things get a little murky. The report does mention they found a guerrilla training camp in Brazil, fully equipped with weapons and tons of communist literature.
Oh, wow. Including Che Guevara's greatest hits, I bet.
Probably. But here's the thing. The report says this particular camp was more of a Brazilian thing, not directly set up by Cuba.
Interesting. So maybe more of an indirect influence, inspiring them with ideas and methods, but not necessarily calling the shots directly?
Yeah, it could be. It's hard to say for sure, but either way, Cuba's influence is definitely being felt in Brazil.
How about Colombia? What was going on there?
More Cuban activity, for sure. This time, they were reportedly helping to train instructors for revolutionary groups, specifically this group called MOEC, the Worker Student Peasant Movement.
Catchy name. It sounds like they were trying to get a broad base of support.
Oh, yeah. Workers, students, peasants, the whole revolutionary trifecta. And the report says they were definitely getting into some serious stuff, engaging in guerrilla warfare, resulting in deaths, captures, the whole 9 yards.
So more direct involvement from Cuba, it seems like.
It does, yeah. Plus, the report mentions increased terrorist activities by MOEC and even claims that Cuba had promised to provide even more help in the future.
So upping the ante, potentially escalating the violence.
That's how it looks.
Moving on, what about Central America? What did the reports have to say about Costa Rica and Nicaragua?
All right, so in Costa Rica, things were a little less clear. The report mentions unconfirmed reports of small-scale training of revolutionaries.
So maybe some whispers and rumors, but nothing concrete.
Right. But there were also reports of increased guerrilla training activity near the Nicaraguan border. And this time it involved a known Nicaraguan revolutionary leader connected to the FLN, the National Liberation Front.
So potential spillover from the conflict in Nicaragua. What about Nicaragua itself?
In Nicaragua, they actually caught one of these guerrillas. And according to this guy, their mission was to set up a base camp specifically for teaching peasants how to be guerrilla fighters.
A school for revolution.
Basically. And this captured guerrilla claimed that he and other FLN leaders had gotten similar training in both Cuba and Honduras.
Interesting. So it wasn't just happening in Cuba, but also in other countries sympathetic to the cause.
Right. Potentially a whole network of training camps throughout the region.
Let's jump down to South America. What about British Guiana?
Ah, British Guiana.
Yeah.
This one's a bit of a head-scratcher. The reports focus on this company called Gimpex, and things get a little shady. Apparently, they got a huge advance payment, like $1 million.
That's a lot of cash.
Yeah, a serious chunk of change. And the report says the belief was that this money was meant for future deliveries of goods to Cuba.
Maybe some kind of backdoor trade deal to get around sanctions?
Possibly, but it gets even weirder. Apparently, Gimpex then turned around and loaned this $1 million to the government of British Guiana.
Okay, now that's suspicious. Why would they do that?
Good question. There were also reports that Gimpex was buying up aircraft, parts, and all sorts of machinery with the intention of shipping it all to Cuba.
So maybe trying to funnel stuff to Cuba indirectly through British Guiana.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the more convoluted schemes we see in these reports.
So we've got direct funding, training camps, maybe shady trade deals. But what were the more common tactics used by the Cubans to support these subversive activities?
Well, according to the reports, one of their go-to methods was literally suitcases full of cash.
Classic spy stuff.
Oh, yeah. Reports from all over the place mention these cash-stuffed suitcases being used to fund various groups. And sometimes the authorities actually managed to catch them and confiscate the money.
A suitcase full of cash isn't exactly subtle.
No, not really. But hey, sometimes you got to go old school.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good picture of what the U.S. was up to and what they thought the Cubans were doing. But how did they react to all this?
They weren't just sitting around, that's for sure. The agency took all these reports super seriously and really made an effort to let everyone know what they thought was going down.
Get the word out, expose the communist threat.
Exactly. They used radio broadcasts and press releases to get their message out. They even broadcast bits of Castro's speeches.
Oh, clever. Use his own words against him.
Exactly. And they also made sure to publicize anytime they discovered what they called, terrorist weapons factories.
Further proof of Cuba's bad intentions.
And they didn't shy away from pointing fingers either. The agency flat out accused Cuba of engaging in terrorism.
So going on the offensive in the war of words, trying to shape public opinion.
100%. But it wasn't just about bad-mouthing Cuba. They also tried to counter their influence with their own propaganda.
Like, here's the truth about Cuba kind of stuff.
Exactly. They created a bunch of pamphlets focusing on different aspects of Cuba. Castro's trip to the Soviet Union, the state of Cuban labor, and the whole situation with political prisoners in Cuba.
Trying to show the darker side of the revolution.
For sure. And these pamphlets were distributed far and wide, trying to counter the image Cuba was trying to project.
Okay, that's the propaganda war. But let's get into the nitty-gritty of the intelligence reports themselves. What were the spies seeing and hearing?
So these intelligence reports, as you might imagine, are kind of all over the place. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they contradict each other, sometimes they're just plain confusing. It's like trying to put together a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
The fog of war, right? Especially in the world of intelligence.
Exactly. But that makes it even more interesting, like you got to really look for those little nuggets of truth. For example, we have this February 1963 report from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA. It says the Venezuelan government raided a pro-Castro group and found a whole bunch of weapons and equipment.
Ah, so some actual evidence of Cuban involvement in arming these groups.
Looks like it. But then, in another report from the same month, the State Department says the British Embassy in the U.S. told them there was no truth whatever to reports of arms being shipped from Cuba to British Guiana.
Wait, so one report says they found weapons and another says there were no arms shipments.
Yep. Classic intelligence conundrum. It really shows how hard it was to get a straight story. And this kind of back and forth happens a lot in these reports.
So frustrating. Like, who do you believe?
Right. You got to weigh the evidence, consider the sources, and try to make sense of it all. And sometimes you just have to accept that you might never know for sure what really happened.
Okay, so what other reports were there about these alleged arms shipments from Cuba?
Well, another CIA report from February 1963 claimed there were ships leaving Cuba loaded with weapons, heading for British Guiana and Venezuela. This one was based on info from refugees and a Cuban national, so, take it with a grain of salt.
Always gotta be skeptical. Any other destinations mentioned?
Yeah, a Nicaraguan journalist told the agency that there were plans to land arms from Cuba in Honduras using a merchant vessel.
So Honduras gets added to the list of potential targets.
Right. And then there's another report where a member of the Venezuelan Communist Party said they were waiting for weapons from Cuba and Panama.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just Cuba acting alone. They were potentially working with others to supply these groups.
It's like a spider web of connections and potential arms deals. But what about those denials from British Guiana? Did those just go away?
Well, the denials kept coming. The State Department sent a telegram saying they'd checked with harbor masters and shipping companies in Georgetown, the capital of British Guiana, and nobody knew anything about Cuban ships carrying weapons. And the governor of British Guiana said he'd looked into it himself and came up empty.
So either the shipments were super secret or someone was lying.
Exactly. And then the premier of British Guiana himself called a newspaper report about Soviet arms shipments from Cuba fantastic and unfounded. So they were definitely sticking to their story.
A lot of smoke, but no fire, maybe?
Maybe. But even if those particular shipments didn't happen, there were definitely other things going on that raised eyebrows.
Like what?
Well, for instance, there was this intelligence note from January 1962 saying that Cuba was planning to set up a secret radio station near Havana, specifically to communicate with people in Cuba and Honduras.
So trying to bypass official channels and get their message directly to the people or maybe even to specific groups or individuals.
Could be. And then there's this report about the Brazilian president, João Goulart. He supposedly told one of his generals to pick some officers to escort people coming from Cuba through Bolivia.
That's strange. Why would they need a military escort?
Yeah, it does make you wonder what they were up to. And it raises questions about how much the Brazilian government knew about these movements and whether they were actively helping the Cubans.
Okay, so potential secret communications and mysterious movements of people. What else?
Another CIA report from February 1963 said that 8 Dominican pro-Castro leaders had traveled to Cuba on a Czech Airlines flight.
So direct contact between Cuban and Dominican revolutionaries. What do you think they were doing there?
My guess is training, coordination, maybe even getting instructions on how to stir up trouble back home.
It's a lot to keep track of. It seems like Venezuela was a particularly hot spot, both in terms of Cuban involvement and internal unrest.
Yeah, for sure. There are tons of reports about all kinds of activities in Venezuela. Extremist groups, police raids, bombings, the works. It seems like the country was really struggling to keep a lid on things.
And we also have evidence that Latin Americans were actually going to Cuba for training, right?
Yeah, that's one thing that seems pretty clear. The reports talk about training camps in Cuba where people from all over Latin America were learning about guerrilla warfare, sabotage, propaganda, and all that good communist stuff.
A real school for revolutionaries. And apparently quite a few graduates. One report mentioned that over 400 Latin Americans returned from the Soviet bloc through Cuba in July 1963.
Yeah, that's a lot of potential troublemakers returning home with new skills and a revolutionary zeal.
So it wasn't just about inspiring people with ideas, they were actively training them to take action.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about propaganda. What kind of efforts were the Cubans making to get their message out?
Propaganda was huge. Definitely a key weapon in their arsenal. They had these international radio broadcasts going out from Cuba, targeting people all over Latin America. The whole point was to paint this picture of Cuba as this super successful revolutionary utopia and to bash the U.S. as the big, bad Yankee imperialists trying to hold everyone down.
Classic Cold War rhetoric, us versus them, good versus evil.
Totally.
Yeah.
And they also had specific broadcasts for certain countries, often featuring exiles from those countries to make it more relatable.
So really tailoring their message to different audiences, using people who could speak directly to their concerns and aspirations.
As they knew what they were doing.
Smart strategy.
Yep.
But propaganda aside, were they also providing direct financial support to these revolutionary groups?
Oh, yeah. There's evidence of that, too. Like one report from November 1963 mentions a group in Guatemala that received $4,000 directly from Castro to fund their guerrilla activities.
That's not a huge amount, but it's definitely direct support.
Yeah. And who knows how many other groups were getting similar funding. The reports only give us a glimpse, remember?
Yeah.
There's probably a lot we don't know.
True. It's like the tip of the iceberg. And it wasn't just a few isolated countries, was it? It seems like Cuba had their fingers in a lot of pies across Latin America.
Yeah, pretty much everywhere you look, there's some mention of Cuban activity or influence. Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela, you name it. They were involved in some way, either directly or through local communist parties and exile groups.
Wow, a real network of revolutions spanning the entire region.
It's impressive, in a way, how much they were able to do with relatively limited resources.
Okay, so we've seen what the U.S. thought the Cubans were doing. But what about Castro's motivations? Did they have any insights into what was driving him?
There's actually this fascinating excerpt from a draft National Intelligence Estimate, an NIE, from February 1963 that tries to get into Castro's head. And what they say is that Castro really believed that armed revolution was the way to go, that it could work anywhere, not just in Cuba.
So, like, he saw himself as the model, the blueprint for revolution in Latin America.
Exactly. And the NIE says he thought it could be done even without direct military support from Cuba or the Soviet Union. It's got to spark the flame and let the people take it from there.
A bold strategy, for sure.
But not everyone was on board with this approach, even among the communists. The NIE mentions that some of the older, more established communist parties in Latin America weren't too keen on Castro's more violent methods.
So divisions within the communist world, different ideas about how to achieve their goals.
Right. And it makes sense. Some of those parties have been around for decades, playing the long game, trying to win elections and gain power gradually. Castro's sudden revolution probably seemed too risky and unpredictable to them.
Like, hey, we've got a good thing going here. Don't rock the boat.
Yeah, something like that. But for Castro, revolution was the only way.
Okay, so Castro believed in revolution, and he was actively training people from other countries to carry it out. What did the Cubans themselves think was their most effective method of spreading their influence?
One of the top guys in the Cuban Communist Party said, flat out, that training Latin Americans in Cuba was their best weapon.
So more than propaganda, more than money, it was all about giving people the skills and the ideology to start revolutions back home.
That seems to have been their main focus. And it looks like their rhetoric about spreading revolution actually got more aggressive after the missile crisis.
Really? Why do you think that was?
Maybe they felt like they had stood up to the U.S., proven they were a force to be reckoned with, and now they were ready to push their agenda even harder.
Like, we survived the worst, now let's go for it.
Exactly. And there's a lot of focus on the Brazilian Communist Party in these reports. Seems like they were particularly active and had a close relationship with Cuba.
What were they up to?
Well, one report says that in December 1962, the top brass of the Brazilian Communist Party had a meeting where they discussed going to Cuba to talk about political strategy and how to increase their pro-Cuba activities in Brazil.
So coordinating with the Cubans on how to stir things up back home.
That's what it looks like.
Mm.
But interestingly, there was another report saying that the Brazilian communists were actually divided about how much they supported Cuba's more radical approach.
Internal disagreements, even among those who were sympathetic to the Cuban Revolution.
Yeah, it shows that it wasn't all black and white. There were different shades of opinion even within the communist movement.
Okay, what about Mexico? Did they have any significant players connected to Cuba?
They did, actually. There's a report from February 1963 about this guy, Vicente Lombardo Toledano, a big shot in Mexican politics, who had close ties to the Cuban leadership. Apparently, he was planning a trip to Brazil, maybe to talk about regional strategy with other communist groups.
So, building alliances, trying to create a broader network of communist influence.
Yeah, could be. But here's the thing. Not everyone in Latin America was freaking out about the communist threat.
Interesting. So, despite all the U.S. rhetoric about the domino effect and the Red Menace, not everyone was buying it.
It's exactly. A report based on a survey of business leaders in Sao Paulo, Brazil, found that they weren't really all that worried about communism.
Maybe they had other things to worry about, like their businesses and the economy.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that not everyone saw the world in the same stark Cold War terms as the U.S. government.
Okay, so we've got this guy, Lombardo Toledano in Mexico, who's buddy-buddy with Castro. Any other Mexican politicians on Cuba's radar?
Yeah, there's a telegram from January 1963 mentioning another Mexican politician, Manuel Gutierrez, who got a super warm welcome from Castro in Cuba. And the telegram says there were rumors that Gutierrez was planning to rile up Mexican workers and farmers, maybe at Cuba's behest.
So potentially using local politicians to sow discord and instability.
That's one way to interpret it.
What about Panama? Anything interesting happening there?
Oh yeah, Panama had its share of intrigue. A February 1963 report says that this Panamanian politician, Ruperto Luther Thomas, offered to set up a whole spy network in Panama for Cuba, specifically targeting U.S. military installations in the Panama Canal Zone.
Whoa, that would have been a major intelligence coup for Cuba if they could pull it off.
Definitely. Imagine the kind of information they could have gotten their hands on.
Talk about a security nightmare for the U.S.
No kidding.
Okay.
But it's unclear from the report if this plan ever actually went anywhere.
Okay, so lots of potential threats, real or imagined. How are other countries reacting to all this?
Well, it seems like Peru was taking a hard line against communism. A January 1963 DIA intelligence bulletin specifically mentioned that the Peruvian government was cracking down on communist groups, arresting people, and shutting down publications.
So a real anti-communist purge.
Yeah, pretty much. They weren't messing around. And in Venezuela, the situation was getting even more volatile. A report says that the Venezuelan Communist Party was planning to ramp up the violence, including bombings in Caracas.
So the threat of terrorism was real and growing.
It seems so.
Okay, remember that ship we talked about earlier, the Michirinsk? The one suspected of carrying arms and subversives from Cuba to British Guiana?
Oh yeah, the mysterious freighter.
Well, in September 1963, the U.S. was actually keeping tabs on that ship. They were convinced it was up to no good.
But they didn't find anything, did they?
Nope. The British police searched the ship, but they didn't find any weapons or anything suspicious. It's like the whole thing was a ghost ship.
Or maybe they were just really good at hiding the evidence.
True. You never know.
And Peru was getting even tougher on anyone suspected of being involved in subversive activities. In August 1963, they passed a new law that made the penalties for guerrilla activities and making weapons illegally a lot harsher.
Sending a message loud and clear, don't even think about it.
Exactly. And despite all those rumors about arms smuggling from Cuba to British Guiana, the U.S. consulate in Georgetown couldn't find any proof.
They were specifically told to investigate, but they kept coming up empty.
Right. So either the shipments were super secret, or there were just a lot of rumors flying around.
It's hard to say for sure.
Intelligence is like that sometimes. You got to sift through a lot of noise to find the signal.
Speaking of sifting through noise, let's talk about the CIA's propaganda efforts again. It seems like they were really putting a lot of resources into countering the Cuban narrative, especially using Voice of America radio broadcasts.
Oh yeah, Voice of America was their big gun. They had all sorts of programs and commentaries about Cuba, specifically targeting Latin American audiences.
What kind of stuff were they talking about?
They covered a wide range of topics. They talked about how communist embassies were being used for subversive activities. They criticized American students who visited Cuba. They highlighted the struggles of Cuban workers. They talked about the plight of political prisoners. And they even analyzed Che Guevara's revolutionary strategies. They basically threw everything they could at the wall to see what would stick.
A real information blitz. Were they having any impact?
Well, the reports say the Cuban radio was really angry about the Voice of America broadcasts, especially the ones that talked about Che Guevara. So it seems like they were hitting a nerve.
Makes sense. If you're trying to undermine someone, you go after their heroes.
Exactly. And it wasn't just radio propaganda. The CIA was also involved in some more direct actions, like they helped a Cuban athlete defect in Brazil.
Like a real-life Cold War thriller.
Totally. And they also assisted the Guatemalan government in interrogating people suspected of being communists.
So getting their hands dirty, working behind the scenes to counter Cuban influence.
Exactly.
And they even collaborated with local intelligence agencies sometimes.
Yeah, like in Uruguay, the CIA arranged an interview with a top military intelligence officer to talk about Cuban activities in the region. And that led to a big report and a lot more concern in Uruguay about Cuban influence.
So a real team effort working with allies to contain the communist threat.
Definitely.
Okay, we've talked a lot about what the U.S. thought the Cubans were doing, but let's shift gears and talk about what the CIA itself was up to during this period. What were their main priorities when it came to Cuba in the early 1960s?
Well, they had a lot on their plate. According to a program review from January 1962, their main tasks included collecting intel on Cuban personnel, trying to recruit agents, and coming up with plans to get lower-level Cuban officials to defect.
Classic spy stuff. Recruiting, defections, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. They were also involved in black market activities, which is kind of vague, but probably meant trying to disrupt the Cuban economy and gather information.
Makes sense. Hit them where it hurts, financially and informationally.
Right. And then, in early 1963, they had this priority operations schedule outlining their most immediate goals. One of those was to keep the Voice of Free Cuba running.
That's the propaganda radio station we talked about earlier.
Yep, that's the one. They also wanted to drop leaflets into Cuba using balloons.
Balloon drops. That's kind of low tech, but I guess it would be hard to trace.
Exactly. And it would get their message directly to the Cuban people, bypassing any censorship. They were also recruiting these 21-man teams, probably for some kind of clandestine mission inside Cuba.
Sounds like they were preparing for some kind of direct action, maybe supporting an internal uprising or something like that.
Yeah, could be. And they were also still working on counterfeiting Cuban currency.
Trying to destabilize the Cuban economy even further.
Exactly.
So a whole range of activities, from propaganda to economic sabotage to potential covert operations. It's clear they were throwing everything they had at trying to undermine the Castro regime.
Definitely. And it shows just how high the stakes were during this period.
Wow. This has been an amazing deep dive into a really complex and fascinating period in history. What would you say are some of the key takeaways from all these documents?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is just how much effort the U.S. was putting into countering what they saw as a very real threat from Cuba. They were trying to contain communism, prevent the spread of revolution, and ultimately get rid of Castro.
And it wasn't just talk. They were using every tool at their disposal. Diplomacy, economic pressure, propaganda, intelligence gathering, and even covert operations.
Right. And for the Cuban side, it's clear that they were actively involved in supporting revolutionary movements throughout Latin America.
Hmm.
But the extent of their involvement varied from country to country, and there's a lot of conflicting information in the report, so it's hard to say definitively how much they were directly controlling things versus just providing support to existing movements.